Bear with me. All right. We have slides. So okay, so I've called today's lesson the Golden Aeon, and we're looking at the European alchemical traditions. And I want to try and cover three things today. I've probably got more material than I need, so we'll see how we go. But I want to look at the emergence of European alchemy. I want to look at the idea of the Golden Age. I want to finish with the ideas of the Anima Mundi and the Spiritus Mundi, the world soul and the world spirit. So European alchemy emerges in Spain in the 12th century. And it emerges out of the Islamic alchemical tradition. It emerges through translations of Arabic texts into Latin. And this is in the 12th century during a period where, as far as I'm aware, it was transitional between Muslim and Christian rule. And it seems to be predominantly in Cordoba that our texts start emerging. Cordoba, along with Palermo in Italy, or Sicily, I should say, were two of the most. They were the two largest cities, population-wise, in Western Europe in this period. There were centers of learning and education, trade, culture, and also translation. All things ruled by Mercury. Now, a brief word about the background. We looked at the Islamicate alchemical tradition a few weeks ago, and I think we mainly looked at the earlier period of that tradition. By the 12th century, or certainly by the 10th century, the Muslim Empire had spread west from the Levant through Egypt, across the north coast of Africa, and then across the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain. I think by the 12th century, there'd been about 4 centuries of Islamic rule in Spain. We don't know too much about the exact kinds of alchemy that we see in Spain, specifically in this late medieval period. But we do one of the traditions or the texts that we do know is the Rutbat al-Hakim, the rank of the sage, and this was a companion text. It was part of a 2-volume series that was paired with the Gayat al-Hakim, the goal or the aim of the sage. And these two texts are very interesting because they were a pair. And the first one, the Rutbat al-Hakim, was on alchemy. The second was on talismanic magic, specifically astrological and planetary magic, the magic of making astral talismans. Now, what this indicates is, at least in the tradition of the Rutbat al-Hakim, is that alchemy was conceived very closely as going hand in hand with magic and astrology. Now, this is something that this is important because we see alchemy, magic, and astrology as sister sciences. The Rutbat al-Hakim, the rank of the sage, was a text that was considered foundational to the astral magic and the talismanic magic of the Gayat al-Hakim. So the sciences were conceived as a whole. Now, the Gayat al-Hakim would go on to be translated as the Picatrix and would exert a fairly powerful influence upon Western occult magical traditions, particularly upon Marsilio Ficino and upon Cornelius Agrippa, among many others. But the Rutbat al-Hakim was not translated. It still hasn't been translated into any language, as far as I know. But this is the kind of context. This is the footprint of alchemy close to the period in which we start to see our first Latin translations of Arabic alchemical texts. And just to paint a very brief, very brief historical portrait to give us some idea of the shape of the territory, I just want to walk through a few centuries of European alchemy. So the 12th century is when we start to see our Latin translations of Arabic texts. The 13th century, we start seeing Latin compositions based upon these translations. And then by the 14th century, we start to see more original compositions, which until that point had been largely derivative or merely purely translations. By the 15th century, we have the Renaissance, and quite a few things happen here. One of them is that Gutenberg invents the movable type printing press, and this forever changes the shape of alchemical literature, because up until this point, everything had been handwritten in manuscripts, handwritten on parchment or papyrus. Now we have printed texts. So alchemical works not only proliferate, but they also proliferate in the vernacular languages of Europe. So in German, in French, in Italian, and also in English. The Renaissance is so called because it is the rebirth, literally, of classical wisdom. And this is in no small part due to a figure named Marsilio Ficino. And Ficino translated, he was commissioned to translate the Hermetic and Platonic corpuses. And what's interesting about Ficino and his translation project in Florence is that he translated the Hermetica, the philosophical Hermetica, our Greek Hermetica, before he translated Plato, because at this time, Hermes Trismegistus was considered a quasi historical figure who was understood to be older than Plato, who was understood to have lived around the time of Moses. So the Hermetica were translated before Plato and before Plotinus and before the Neoplatonists, because he was considered to be anterior to them. We'll come back to Ficino in some more detail. In the 16th century, we part of the proliferation of printed alchemical texts in vernacular languages, such as German, bring us figures like Paracelsus, who was a medical practitioner who revolutionized the iatrochemistry, or the medicinal alchemy. Paracelsus, among many other things, introduced the idea of salt to the alchemical dyad of sulfur and mercury. So we have this trinity, this triad of sulfur, mercury, and salt, which of course do not refer to the common mineral or metallic substances. I was hoping to speak a bit more about Paracelsus and the tria prima of sulfur, mercury, and salt today. I'm not sure if I will have time, so we're going to revisit this Hermetic Trinity, certainly in our next lesson, if not today. So by the 17th century, we start to see the first inklings of the scientific revolution. Now, alchemy is still going very, very strong, but alchemy is going very strong, and precisely because of this, we get the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution seems to emerge largely out of practicing alchemists, at least in terms of developments in chemistry. And I'm going to talk about the emergence of science and what that meant for alchemy in more detail in next week's lesson. But that's just a very brief, very, very brief walk through several centuries of European historical territory. But now I want to go back to the 12th century and to our very first Latin European alchemical text. And this is the Liber di Compositione Alchemiae, the book on the composition of alchemy. Now, what's interesting about this text is that it's a translation of an Arabic text, which is one of the very first Arabic alchemical texts as well. It's bound to the figure of Khalid, the prince, the Arab prince Khalid, who, as we learned about a few weeks ago, was, at least according to Arabic tradition, scholars tend to debate this, but at least according to Arabic tradition, Khalid was the figure who commissioned philosophers in Egypt to translate alchemical texts from Greek and Coptic into Arabic, and these translations were said to be the first translations into Arabic under Islam, not just of alchemy, but of any text. So this figure of Khalid, who also had an interaction with the wise monk Morienus, a Byzantine monk who lived as a recluse in a monastery outside of Jerusalem, somewhere between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, in the desert mountains. And so we have this Arabic text, which is a record of their dialogue or their interaction. And this is the very first text that is translated into Latin in the 12th century. So it's a very nice kind of bookend to the beginning of the Arabic alchemical tradition, and also the beginning of the Latin European alchemical tradition. I'm not sure if this translation choice was intentional, but either way, it holds this interesting weight. So the work is about the composition of alchemy is about the composition or the creation of the stone, the alchemical elixir. And the text tells us whoever requires other than the stone for the great work is like a man attempting to climb a stair that has no steps. He falls flat on his face. And this is what is depicted in this image that we see here. And so Khalid asks Morienus, where is the source of this thing? Where may it be gathered? And just as an interesting aside, the term for source is minera, meaning mine. He's asking, where is the source? Where is the mine from which this thing can be gathered? Morienus falls silent. He casts his gaze downward. He reflects deeply and he speaks. Truly, this matter is that which is created by God and which is firmly held within you yourself, inseparable from you, wherever you be. And any creature of God deprived of it will die. This matter comes from you. You yourself are its source. You yourself are where it is found and whence it is taken. When you see this, your zeal for it will increase. Now, this is an incredibly interesting passage because it tells us that the source of the alchemical substance for making the stone is in ourselves. And this is interesting because it both points to it seems to point to an explicit internal alchemy. You know, we are the subject of the work. But as we'll see, it's a little bit more slippery than that. What we're dealing with something that is both within the human being, but also within all. It's a life substance, which is within all things, including ourselves. Generally speaking, the alchemy of this period was directed towards the goals of gold making and the extension of the human lifespan. Similar to the other traditions that we've been looking at. Roger Bacon in the 13th century was a Franciscan friar and has come down as an important medieval philosopher. He makes a distinction between speculative alchemy and operative alchemy. And speculative in this context refers to the process of observing and reflecting upon things before one goes and does the operative work. So this distinction between speculative alchemy and operative alchemy would continue, and we find it. It's not exactly the same as a internal and external alchemy, but it corresponds perhaps more to the distinction that we saw with the Hermetica between a philosophical and a practical Hermetica. So the theory and the praxis. But with this similar sentiment, a more spiritual division, you might say, comes up in the phrase ora et labora, which means pray and work. And this is a phrase that came out of, I believe, Catholic religious praxis, but also became specifically emphasized in alchemical traditions of this period. which were inseparable from Christianity. So alchemy for Roger Bacon speaks of the art of making noble metals, among other things, in a way that is better than nature herself can produce. But it also points to the ability to extend the human lifespan beyond its natural length, but also providing for the expenses and other countless needs of the state. And this is an interesting point, because it brings us to the theme that I want to emphasize today, and that is the idea of the golden age. That alchemy wasn't only about transforming lesser metals into gold. It wasn't only about extending the human lifespan or restoring the human being to its primordial health. It ultimately sought, at least in certain currents of alchemy, it ultimately sought to restore paradise, to restore an essentially Christian utopia upon earth. And the roots of this go back to classical times. The idea of the golden age, the aurea secula, has its roots in Hesiod and also Virgil. Hesiod tells us that the deathless gods who dwell on Olympus made a golden race of mortal men who lived in the time of Kronos, or Saturn, when he was reigning in heaven. And they lived like gods without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil and grief. Now, what's interesting here is we have this metallurgical symbolic connected with the ages of human beings, the ages of human civilization, which is the opposite of progress. It's the opposite of our modern view that we're progressing forwards and improving at every step. It says we begin in the golden age and then we decline into the age of silver, into the age of bronze, into the age of iron. And that each step of decline is a downward spiral of human moral decline. Now, what's interesting here is that Saturn, or Kronos, is connected with the idea of the golden age. So Saturn is usually the god associated with the metal lead, the lowest of the alchemical metals. And here we see him associated with the age of gold. So when Saturn is liberated and free and is a ruler, the age he rules is golden. And in this image here, we can see Saturn lying supine in the clouds, presiding over a humanity who is largely laying around, making love, and eating fruit. This is a very different kind of Saturn than we're used to encountering. Saturn usually rules death, toil, suffering, hardship, age, illness. So here he presides over a realm of effortless abundance and ease. This golden age presided over by Saturn was anticipated to return. But in Roman times, Virgil says the reign of Saturn is restored and a new generation descends from heaven on high. The iron brood shall at last cease and a golden race spring up throughout the world. This was the hope of the return to the Golden Age. But this metallurgical symbolic that Saturn somehow contains gold is has some really interesting has a really interesting lineage. It goes back as far as Jabir. Jabir says that lead is cold and dry externally, but hot and humid internally. And as for gold, it is hot and humid externally, but internally it is cold and dry. So lead is internally gold. Gold is internally lead. And so to turn lead into gold, you simply had to invert the lead to bring its inner nature, its batin, its esoteric or inner part, out into the open, into the external or zahir. This was the process that the Greeks called extrophe, the inversion of turning the depths of the substance inside out. Similarly, Ficino brings this connection between lead and gold to the fore. He says, do not doubt that Saturn has quite a bit to do with gold. His weight leads people to believe so. Furthermore, gold, being similar to the sun, is by the same token in all metals, in the same way that the sun is in all planets and stars. And we have a spiritual resonance of this going back to as far as Zosimos of Panopolis. It's not as explicit, but Zosimos speaks of a phos anthropos, a being of light, which is concealed within the earthly body, the being of earth, the Adamic man, the man of clay. And the spiritual path for Zosimos was of releasing the man of light from the man of earth or clay. And I think I'm hoping to return to this theme from Zosimos in our final class, but I just wanted to at least anchor it here and now because we see this motif of releasing the internal gold. And with this, we start to see quite explicitly a desire for a terrestrial paradise, alchemy being concerned with restoring the state of Eden, the pre-fallen state of humanity. This comes to explicit expression with Jakob Boehme, the alchemical mystic, who says that paradise is still in this world, yet humankind does not occupy it. For you see, this gold is locked inside Saturn. Boehme was concerned with an explicitly spiritual alchemy, which sought no less than the spiritual resurrection of the human being. And here he's speaking of the explicit restoration of paradise. In the early 17th century, the Rosicrucian manifestos, which were Hermetic alchemical manifestos, spoke of a universal reformation of humanity. It's as part of a current that was trying to actually change human civilization in an alchemical way. And in the same century, an obscure text by a figure called Huguenus Abama explicitly signals this in its title. It was called The Reign of Saturn, Transformed into an Age of Gold. And what's interesting about this text is that apart from its title, it doesn't shed any light at all upon these themes. It's a text for creating the alchemical stone, the substance of transformation, which can potentially lead to the kind of universal reformation of humanity spoken of in the Rosicrucian manifestos. But what the text does speak about, what the text does speak to, perhaps clearer than some texts, is a tradition that came to the fore, particularly in the 17th century, in which alchemy sought what they called the spiritus mundi, the art of transformation. The crux of alchemical transmutation did not hinge upon chemical processes. It sought what they called the universal spirit. And I want to spend, let's see, what time we have left, speaking a bit more about this idea of the universal spirit. And to understand the universal spirit and the universal soul, the anima mundi, the spiritus mundi, I want to look at Ficino's Neoplatonic cosmology. And in doing that, I just want to refresh our memory briefly with the cosmological synopsis that we looked at when we looked at Jabir ibn Hayyan. And this was again a Neoplatonized cosmology. Jabir was getting his Neoplatonism probably from less direct sources than Ficino. Ficino was literally translating the Greek texts, whereas we're not quite sure how or where Jabir was getting his Neoplatonic cosmology. We just know that it was there. We have this framework of the universal mind, the universal soul, the universal spirit, and the universal body. And this corresponds more or less to the framework that we looked at with Jabir. But there is one, I wouldn't say difference, but there's a shift of terminology. And it's not an exact overlap, but I think I spoke, I think I tried to emphasize in our class on the Islamicate tradition how much of the alchemical process hinged upon this relationship of the soul to substance, and how the interaction of soul and substance gave rise to all the primordial polarities like movement and stillness, and heat and coldness, dryness and humidity, fire and water, and ultimately sulfur and mercury. In Ficino's tradition, at least in his De Vita, his 3 books on life, he speaks more about the universal spirit rather than substance. This universal spirit seems to take the role of something that is like substance, but also like spirit. And again, this speaks to what I think is the most interesting and mysterious aspect of alchemy. It is this idea of substance or spirit. The more we try and pin it down as a substance, the more it appears to be more like a spirit. The more we try and capture it as a spirit, the more it might seem to be more like a substance. there's almost like an alchemical uncertainty principle with the universal spirit and substance. But the main role for Ficino that the universal spirit plays is as a vehicle for the universal soul. So it is the vehicle or the means by which the universal soul acts upon and creates the universal body, which is the natural cosmos as we know it. So in this way, it also corresponds to some degree to the idea of the natures that we saw in Jabir, which were the invisible formative principles, the invisible natures, which shape the visible or tangible cosmos as we know it. And this is the substance, this universal spirit substance is really the focus of what seems to be laboratory and our operative alchemy certainly in the 17th century and later, but we'll try and stick within our bounds today. So this idea of the universal spirit being a vehicle for the universal soul or world soul. With this comes the idea that what is known as the seminal reasons, these seed principles that are carried in the world soul, are transmitted through the universal spirit into elemental matter. Ficino says, the world soul possesses by divine power precisely as many seminal reasons of things as there are ideas in the divine mind. By these seminal reasons, she fashions the same number of species in matter. So this idea of seminal reasons, it's the rationes seminales in Ficino. This is more or less the spermatikoi logoi of Plotinus. The seed reasons, seminal reasons. It's a strange kind of concept, but these are on one hand rationes. They are ratios. They're almost harmonic proportions of geometric precision, which are like the paradigm or the template upon which elemental things are based and created. As logoi, they are words or even formulas which perhaps magically evoke the invisible into visibility. As seeds, they are specifying principles. They take the universal substance, which is unspecified. It has a formless plasticity. It takes this formless substance and specifies it into determined form. This is the alchemical function of the seed. And this is what was sought through the universal spirit, which bore the seeds, the seminal reasons, into elemental matter. And Ficino speaks of this flow of the divine ray, the flow of the divine ray. He says, beauty is the ray of God. Such a ray forms a species of all things that we call ideas when they are in the angelic mind, reasons when they are in the soul, seeds when they are in nature, and forms when they are in matter. So we have this one through line from divine ideas down to material forms. And we see how it progresses from an intelligible to a rational to a formative and ultimately to a formed reality. So a little bit more about the nature of the universal spirit. Again, from Ficino. He says, the world generates everything through the world spirit, and we can call it both heaven and quintessence. It is practically the same thing in the world's body as in our body. Okay. So if we remember back to Khalid and Morienus, and Morienus telling Khalid that the substance, the thing, is in your own body. This, as far as I can tell, is what he's referring to. He's not necessarily referring to an internal alchemy, but he's not necessarily not referring to an internal alchemy. He's referring more to this universal spirit, which is in all things. Immediately through the spirit, the world soul gives birth to the four elements, as though everything were contained in the power of that spirit. So through the spirit, the four elements as we know them are brought into being. And this is very similar to the idea of the four natures that we saw again with Jabir, the four natures, which are the qualities of heat, coldness, dryness, and humidity, which are invisible formative forces which precede but shape formless substance into formed or elemental existence. Spirit itself is a very tenuous body, as if now it were a soul and not body, and now body and not soul. So in regards to the metallurgical alchemy, this spirit was the substance that was the substance that was sought in the process of transmuting metals. Alchemists sought this, what they called the spirit of metals. And by spirit of metals, they refer to the universal spirit in its orientation towards the metallic kingdom. Diligent natural philosophers, when they separate this spirit from gold by sublimation over fire, will employ it on any of the metals and will make it gold. This spirit, rightly drawn from gold or something else and preserved, the Arab philosophers called elixir. So many of our alchemical texts from this period speak of the spirit of metals and the seed of metals. And they're referring to this specifying seed principle, which comes from ultimately the divine. It's ultimately pre-material, pre-elemental, but it determines the nature of the species. We have this movement from the universal to the particular that's very important. We have universal seeds, which then become differentiated and determine specific species in nature. And so a universal seed that is oriented to the metallic kingdom will generate the species of metals. The universal seed oriented towards the vegetable or animal kingdom will create different beings in the elemental world. So the aims of alchemy in this tradition were to trace back a thing to its pre-material, pre-elemental seed spirit. And because the seed spirit was a formative force, it could restore the formed nature of the thing back to its I guess its ideal state. So we have this idea that things deviate from their pattern or their paradigm or their template that is God-given through this universal spirit. And instead of trying to change things on an elemental or chemical level, certain alchemists sought to trace back to the seed logos, the divine idea, which created the thing in the first place, and to use this impulse to restore the thing to its proper form. Now, what's interesting here is this changes our understanding of elements. The four elements were very closely related to these seed concepts. The four elements go back as far as Empedocles, the pre-Socratic philosopher, who considered them divine. They were deities, but they formed four divine, he called them roots, divine roots. Paracelsus called them matrices or mothers. Okay, there were wombs there were wombs or receptacles for these universal seeds, through which the universal entered into the particular, through which an undetermined formlessness could become a specified form. So, yeah, we have this, I guess Empedocles and Paracelsus both are pointing to a similar frame of reference. Roots, okay, roots. Something, the seeds are taking root in the elements. The elements become roots. For Paracelsus, the elements are the matrices, the wombs, the mothers, the receptacles. Paracelsus also has this really interesting concept that he called the Iliaster. And Paracelsus would often coin his own terminology, often from Greek or quasi-Greek terms. And Iliaster is one of these Paracelsian coinages, which derives, as far as we can tell, from the Greek word hule or hyle, the primordial matter, the prima materia, and aster, star, the celestial ether or quintessence. So the Iliaster for Paracelsus was this juncture, this fusion of matter, prime matter, and star substance. It's the juncture of the the proto-material and the celestial. These come together to form the first, this is the first alchemical matter proper. It's sometimes the chaos, because heaven is mixed with earth, much as seeds are mixed in the womb. And from this primordial massa confusa, they sometimes call it, the confused mass, the blending of heaven and earth, the four elements arise in the cosmology of Paracelsus. So there's more that can be said about this, but I just wanted to, I guess, bring things towards a close with this idea of the elements as mothers, receptacles of these universal seeds. And we see here in this image, the four elements are depicted as women bearing vessels upon their heads. And from left to right, we have earth. From left to right, we have the two feminine elements, earth and water. So the downward pointing triangles refer to the downward tending, heavier elements. The next two are air and fire. The upward pointing triangles are the lighter, upward rising elements. So water sinks, fire rises, okay? And on their heads, they're bearing vessels, which each of which has some kind of being in the vessel. And the earth and in the earth element, we have some kind of humanoid. In the water element, I'm not quite sure what we have. If anyone has a good guess, please let me know. Presumably some water-oriented species. In the air element, we have a bird-like creature, and in the fire element, we have what looks like a lion. And this points back to a motif in the Kore Kosmou, which is one of our Greek Hermetic texts from the Philosophical Hermetica, in which the four elements were understood as not so much as the substances of fire or air or water or earth as we know them, but as, I guess, elemental domains which gave rise to different forms of life. So air would give rise to birds and creatures that fly. Water would give rise to sea creatures, things that swim, and so on and so forth. So again, the elements are these maternal matrices which generate beings. And this was, at least in certain traditions of alchemy in the Western European period that we're looking at, this gets more to the core, I think, of what is going on with alchemy that is usually dismissed as merely laboratory, because we're not dealing with experimental chemistry here. We're dealing with an engagement with invisible, metaphysical, formative forces that are being engaged to shape matter, to restore forms to their primordial perfection in a way that is consistent with how divine creation was intended. So, And just to wrap up, I think this is interesting because in terms of our cosmogonic arc of alchemy, much of this very much fits within our cosmogonic arc of alchemy. But it's an alchemy that's not seeking to escape the created world. It's an alchemy that's trying to transform the created world in a way that is consistent with the divine idea, the divine logos, the seminal reasons which created this world. And this is a form of participation in creation, participation in cosmogenesis. And as we saw earlier, it's one of its expressions, one of its ultimate expressions was to restore the paradisiacal state on Earth, to restore terrestrial paradise. And with that being said, I think our time is about up. So I will bring the class to a close, and we can start taking some questions.